In this video, I'm going to talk about how we count half-beat values. Now, as just a general overview, and what's written here on this sheet is that when we have half-beat values, we don't usually count them as 1, 1.5, 2, 2.5. It's just a mouthful. And so oftentimes instead what we do is we'll split beats into two equal halves, but we keep the numbers where the beat usually occur. So like for example, if I have like quarter notes, whenever I'm counting, I will usually count 1, 2, 3, or 4. And then whenever I, of course, have half beat values, then again, we will go ahead and use a different thing to represent that. So for example, whenever we're dealing with eighth notes are a half beat value, especially whenever we have a 4 on the bottom of our time signature. Because of course that 4 means that a quarter note is 1 beat. Now, this is something and sort of how counts written in would look like. We have 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus, and then we have 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus, and again, something that I've put in here is the fact that the dotted quarter note is equal to 1.5 beats. But again, a lot of that's quite confusing unless we understand, okay, first of all, what is exactly half of a beat? And then second of all, how do we actually count these things? What do the pluses even mean? So when we're talking about half of a beat is whenever, again, we have a beat, for example, like in this example here, we have 2, 4, and a quarter note here, again, because the 4 is on the bottom, the quarter note is equal to 1 beat. Now, oftentimes what we have to ask ourselves is that, okay, that quarter note is equal to 2 of what other note? So it takes 2 eighth notes, actually, to make 1 quarter note. So again, 2 eighth notes equals 1 quarter note. And so just 1 eighth note ends up becoming half of that quarter note, right? Because again, we would need 2 eighth notes in order to make a full quarter note. If I get rid of one of them, again, half of that's gone, right? And so oftentimes whenever we count half beats, we will split the beats into 2 halves by adding a plus sign. And that plus sign, the way that we actually say the word is we say the word and. We usually say the word and. And then as we go through, again, then we have to just start to figure out, okay, how much are like certain notes in a given example. And so if I zoom in here for a second on our example that we're working on, specifically we'll notice that we have this 2-4 example, and then we have all of these other notes here, right? Now one thing, and it's kind of hard to see here, is that we have a dotted quarter note, okay? So again, a dotted quarter note is equal to 1 and a half beats, right? And then again, we have an eighth note by itself that's equal to half a beat. And this is kind of the way that I like to start figuring things out is, okay, can we go ahead and figure out what our half beats are, okay? Now, after we end up figuring that out, again, then we can go ahead and start kind of writing in our counts. So remember, when I start using this word and, or the plus sign, really what that means is that we're really just dealing with half beats. We're counting everything based on half beats. So now all of a sudden, when we're saying like 1 and 2 and, the 1, the and, the 2, the and, all of those things are representing half beat values. So for example, whenever we're dealing here with a dotted quarter note, again, a dotted quarter note is equal to 1.5 beats. And so that's why we would need 1 and then 2. Because again, 1 by itself would be half a beat, then and would be another half, so that together equals 1 full beat. And then 2, the number 2, is referring to the first half of the second beat, right? We still haven't gotten to the and that's right here, right? That and by itself would be the second half of beat number 2. And so again, here we would have 1 and 2 during the first dotted quarter note, which represents, again, 1.5 beats, and then we would have the half beat there on the and for the eighth note. After that, again, eighth notes will be for each one of those counts. So like 1, again, it represents the first half of beat number 1, so we have that eighth note there. And represents the second half of beat number 1, so that lines up with that eighth note. Now here we have a quarter note. That quarter note, again, is worth a full beat, so that's why it gets the full second beat, 2 and. It's not just 2. Oftentimes, it's very, very normal for us to go ahead and stop on 2 because that's the usual way that we'll count quarter notes. we'll usually count them as, 1, 2, or 1, 2, 3. But it's best to keep it consistent in terms of how you count. And so again, here, whenever we have the quarter note again, it's a full first beat. So we get 1 and, so those two halves together equals 1 whole. And then again, we have the 8th note here on 2, and then the 8th note here on and. And then here we have 2 8th rests. Each of them gets part of those counts. And then, of course, the quarter rest gets the full of the second beat. So now, here we have specifically the counts in a 4/4 bar. Now, I will say is that we have a pickup here, right? And if you remember what a pickup is, it's a measure that's not necessarily full at the very, very beginning. What this allows for is greater variety at the beginnings of our pieces of music. Not everything necessarily has to start on beat number 1. Again, we have a dotted quarter note here that we start with. So again, you can go ahead and pause the video here and try to give it a shot. But what I'm going to go ahead and do is that I'm going to go ahead and fill this one out. So whenever we have a pickup, again, this isn't like it's beat number 1 and then beat number 2. It actually wouldn't make sense for us to have beat 1 and then 2 and then we have this, measure line here, because that wouldn't necessarily make sense. Usually the way that it works in pieces of music is that the pickup, the first opening portion won't have a full measure, but that will oftentimes be equalized by the very, very last measure. So the last measure will also be incomplete. Now, of course, composers stopped following this rule later on because it became kind of unnecessary. But a lot of hymns that you might see, again, if they start with an incomplete measure, they'll also end with an incomplete measure. But here we would actually start with specifically beat 3. And the reason why I know that is because, again, we have this 8th note here. And we know that that's going to be the and of the final beat in the measure, right? We have 4 beats, so this will be and. And then, again, this dotted quarter note is worth 3 8th notes. 3 8th notes. Remember, it's 1.5, so it's worth 3 half beat values. And so what we would end up having here would be 3 and, so that's your full 1 beat, and then the first half of 4. So it would go 3 and 4 and then and. In the next measure, pretty simple. Here we have an 8th note, so that'll be 1. And again, it can't be all of beat 1. So we can't have 2 on the next 8th note. That wouldn't make sense because the only time that we would ever write that is if we had quarter notes. And so here we would have 1 and, then this would be a full second beat, so 2 and. Then here we have 3 and then of course we have 4 and. And then here at the very, very end, again, keeping with the proper writing style, since we started with a pickup, I have left the last measure incomplete as well. This one just has the first 2 beats of a measure. So here we have 1 and 2, and then this 8th note here would be and. But this has been a video on specifically counting half beat values. Hopefully this has been somewhat helpful in helping you understand 8th notes and half beat values a little bit better.